So I believe we're live, right? Is it 12:30? Ready to start? Okay. We're going to get this going here, all right? Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. We appreciate you tuning into this Facebook Live session of Florida Aquatalk. Aquatalk is a series of short programs through Florida Sea Grant that is being done as part of the recognition for National Seafood Month in October here. By way of introduction, my name is Erik Lovestrand, and I work for the University of Florida as a regional specialized agent for the Florida Sea Grant program, and I also serve as the County Extension Director for the Franklin County Extension Office. And our office is based in the town of Apalachicola here in the mid-Florida Panhandle. Now, when people hear the term Apalachicola, that name seems to be synonymous with oysters for many people. And that's with good reason, because historically Apalachicola Bay, off to our west from where we are today, was actually a very important production area not only in Florida, but in the country, if not the world. Apalachicola Bay historically produced about 90% of Florida's oyster harvest, which is a tremendous amount, 10% of the nation's harvest. And in good years, they were actually harvesting somewhere between 4 to 6 million pounds of oyster meat out of the Apalachicola Bay estuary in a sustainable manner. It could produce that much and be harvested. Now, times have changed for Apalachicola Bay for sure. Okay, we had a fisheries disaster declaration in 2012, and no, we're good. And that was the result, or was done, because we had a major collapse in the oyster fishery in Apalachicola Bay. In part, that story is connected to what we're going to be talking about today, because that decline of available wild harvest of oysters and an increasing demand for shellfish from the public has led to a growth of the shellfish farming industry, or aquaculture, for oysters and clams in particular. Now, I want to cover some of the basics involved in shellfish farming in today's session, but I also want to talk about the opportunity, or talk about some information and a story related to a major impact that has happened on the shellfish industry in this part of the world due to a strong, very strong Category 4 storm coming through this area about a little more than a week ago from today. Hurricane Michael came across this region and just devastated a lot of things in the area. And we'll talk specifically about impacts on the shellfish industry here. Okay? And we will go through this short intro period. We will also take a look at some of the debris and the damage that was done here in the intro. And after we get done with that, we will give you folks some time to actually interact with us and take some questions and have some discussion. All right, let me tell you a few of the basics for the folks that really are not familiar with this industry about farming shellfish. Now, the industry is regulated actually by a state agency. It is the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. They have established about 25 aquaculture use zones in 10 coastal counties around the state. So they manage in that program about 500 leases on over 1,200 acres of water. There are 3 primary commodities that people will grow on aquaculture leases in Florida. One of the most prominent is hard clams, and if you've been to Cedar Key, you know that that area is famous for the clam production down there, and many of those leases are growing clams. Oysters are another primary commodity that are grown on shellfish leases in Florida. In our area here, oysters are the primary crop that are grown on the shellfish leases in these few counties, but we do have a few clams actually being grown here in this area where we're looking at today. People also grow live rock for the aquarium trade on shellfish leases. So it's a variety of things, and people make use of that water to be able to produce a crop that can produce a living for them. Now, in this area where we are today, between Wakulla County over to our east and Franklin County going west from here, we have about 98 leases that are parceled out. And we also have a few now that are located in Gulf County over in Indian Harbor. So how does somebody get involved in oyster aquaculture or shellfish farming? Well, people actually have to apply through the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services to be able to manage a lease parcel. And they need to meet a list of requirements, including a 10-year business plan, which is part of those requirements. And there are application fees involved. There's a fee of $200 that is required for somebody to go through the application process. And then there are annual fees of about $20 to $30 per acre per year that people pay to retain their leases. Now there are also requirements that have to be met in order to keep a lease. There are minimum planting numbers for shellfish on these leases that people need to put out there every year. For clams, I believe it's about 100,000 clams per acre per year that need to be planted on your lease if you're going to maintain that lease. For oysters, it's about 70,000 oysters per acre per year. People also need to do annual audits on their shellfish lease. They need to keep track of information related to where they get their oyster seed, the health certificates that are required to show that that is good stock that they're allowed to use in this area. And they also have to show what they're harvesting off of their leases and selling on the market. Farmers around here actually buy their seed from people who grow and produce that seed in a hatchery or a nursery setting, okay? And they raise those babies up to a size that the farmers can put on their leases. Once they acquire their seed from these places that grow it, they have to put that seed into a mesh bag of some type or a basket and secure it on their lease. Now clam bags are actually staked down to the sandy bottom of the bay that they're growing in. They like to burrow down into the sandy sediment, so they go right down onto the bottom. But most of the oyster growing gear in our area is actually suspended in the water column on some type of a long line system. These animals are filter feeders naturally, so they collect plankton and algae and detritus from the water column to live and grow on. Farmers and processors are also required to follow very strict health and safety rules from the time that the animals are harvested to the time that they reach to the end consumer. There are time and temperature rules that have to be followed diligently, because if somebody gets sick from oysters harvested in one lease area, it can shut down the entire lease area and really impact people economically. So it's very important to follow the rules. Sounds like it might be easy to become an oyster or clam farmer. I would like you to think again, because the information I'm providing today is just the bare bones of what this industry is like and some of the notions or ideas about what it takes to get into this industry. This business is just like any farming endeavor. It really involves a lot of hard work, and it involves continual work. You just cannot leave these animals out there to their own devices. They require a lot of care and attention through the process of growing them from a tiny oyster or clam up to a harvestable animal, okay? There are some risk factors that you have some control over, all right, depending on how you manage your lease. And there are some risk factors that you will have no control over. Shellfish farmers are really a special breed of people who earn every dollar they make in this kind of a job. Okay. Now, Hurricane Michael is one of those factors that you would really have no control over as it came to land here. However, there are some considerations in the type of gear that people use, as well as preparation that they can do with their gear before a storm, that would really make a difference in how well somebody might fare after an event like this is over. We're located here today on the shore of Alligator Harbor in Franklin County on the far east side of the county, where there are 46 leases off in the distance behind me here. Probably can't see the markers or the bags out there right now, but they're out there. And we're going to take a look at something here that will give you an idea of the level of impact that this storm had on this area. Because just off to my right here, we have one of those storm surge markers that you may have seen before along the coast, where they have indicated the levels that the water may get to at a certain category level of a storm. So I'm going to walk over there and we're going to see how high the water got during this event. This yellow area on this post is where a Category 3 storm surge might actually theoretically reach, okay? So from the bottom to the top is that zone where a Category 3 storm might put water up here on this area, okay? Now, as you go up to the top, the blue area, there you go. We're lining up our camera here. The blue area is where a Category 4 storm could reach to, okay? Now, this was a very strong Category 4 storm. I think it lacked about 3 miles an hour from being a Category 5 storm. This post was probably completely overtopped with water here. And that post is probably at least 10 feet above ground level here. And we are at ground level probably at least 2 feet above the water level right now. So 10 to 12 feet of water coming across this area was a pretty amazing system that came through here. All right, we're going to take a look at some of the types of gear that actually did well or didn't do very well. We'll talk about some of that with this system and that kind of event that goes through. Basically, the gear that did well with this storm was any of the gear that growers were able to actually sink down into the water column ahead of the storm. Okay? Some of the gear has floats with removable caps on either end, and those floats were able to be filled with water so the oysters could go down and sit on the bottom. Some of our other gear that's able to be put down into the water column has baskets that are suspended from lines between poles, and those lines could actually be lowered down into snap clips on those poles to get them down into the water before the storm. Much of the floating gear that was left on the surface of the water actually sustained some or a lot of the damage and losses for the industry here as a result of this storm. And a lot of that ended up scattered along Highway 98 here. We're going to take a look at some of that in a little bit. So let's look at some of the cages that we picked up along the shoreline right here. Got that. This is one of the mesh baskets that has a float made out of foam, basically zip tied with 2 zip ties to the basket. Okay, so this is not sinkable unless somebody comes along on their lines and cuts all of the zip ties off and takes the floats away. Now, if they did that, these bags would sit on the bottom, on the line out there. They probably would have been buried in the sediment, and the oysters that were in them would not have survived, but the bags would have still been on the line for a grower to be able to go and bring up and put new oyster seed in. Okay, here's another one that's very similar. You can see that one of the floats actually on this bag is gone, so the zip ties broke on that. This is a bag that has a couple floats that are called bullet floats on it. You can see that it still has oysters in it, and they are obviously not alive. It would be a real chore for somebody to come out here and cut zip ties and pull these floats off of all of the bags that they have out here. Some of them have hundreds and hundreds of bags on their leases out here. So a lot of these stayed on the surface. Now, some of those might have survived pretty well because these floats do not create a tremendous amount of buoyancy, and the surge going over and sinking these bags may not have torn them loose on their lines. Okay? But what happened in our area is that much of the floating gear was actually on the surface when we had a tremendous, go ahead and switch that. We had a tremendous flow of debris, a big field of debris that came across this bay because of the development that occurs over on Alligator Point area there. Okay, we had entire docks. We had 3 or 4 fairly large boats. We had a lot of refrigerators and freezers and anything you can imagine that was down on the ground level of those properties over there came across this bay. Now, much of it ended up getting snagged in the lease gear that was near the surface. It got tangled in the lines, it pulled up poles, it cut lines, and it left a big mess for the growers that had these kinds of bags that were actually sitting on the surface. Many of them may have been okay without that debris that was coming through the lease area out here. Next thing I want to do is kind of walk you through this area where we've got some of the debris and take a little look at it. So we're going to shake the camera around for a little bit as we walk over there and see what we can see. And then in just a few minutes, we'll kind of move to another location where we can take some questions and talk with you folks. I'm hoping Michelle stays safe walking back there trying to keep the camera. Let's come down this way. Watch your step there. Can you see the trash can? That's the trash can that used to be down by the water here. The piles of shells right up here behind me near the edge of the highway, those are oysters that were in these mesh bags that washed up here. A lot of the growers have already been up here collecting their gear and basically dumped out oysters that had not survived so they could collect their bags and take them back to reuse them. Here we go again. This is really a mess here. This is a freezer that was about a third full of meat products, and so it's a real stinky mess. But there are just oodles of refrigerators and freezers along the highways and up into the woods after this storm event. They just floated all the way across the harbor and ended up here. I think you can probably see the rack line from there. It basically ended up piled up along the shoreline here. You're good there. Piled up on the shoreline. We have trees, we have telephone poles in there, lots of boards and wood, structure that came from houses over there across the bay, stairs, oyster equipment, just the whole mix of anything that could be at people's houses and businesses on Alligator Point. All right, we're going to try to move to another spot where we can kind of finish up with some questions and talk for a little while, okay? We've got a couple of mullet fishermen out here making a day of it. This will work. We can set up right here, I think. Okay, I think we're at a point where we can take some questions, and if folks have anything they'd like to learn a little bit more about or ask, if I don't know the answer, we've probably got some folks online today that could help us answer some of those questions. I know we have some really good shellfish folks that are listening in today. Do we have any questions coming through yet? Should I check my phone?
Eric. Anna Carmichael says, old timers say a storm will bring the oysters back. What do you say?
Well, that's a good question, Anna. I remember hearing about, because I wasn't over here at the time, two big storms that came through Apalachicola Bay back in the 80s, Hurricanes Kate and Elena. And in that situation, oyster bars were basically churned up, broken loose. They had tremendous water currents flowing through that bay, buried in the sediment, and they closed that bay for harvest for a while, for about a year. But they had legal-sized oysters growing out there in very short order. So it really depends on how soon factors can return to normal, and oysters can be not stressed, and we can get a good spat set, which are the baby larval oysters actually settling out of the water column and attaching and growing. So I don't know that I have any quantitative data to say, yeah, that's a fact, but I know they have come back very quickly in the past when conditions for growth was good.
Laura asked, how long does it take an oyster to grow in those bags?
It depends on the kind of oyster they're growing, actually. There are a couple of different varieties or types of oysters that are being grown in aquaculture settings like this. The traditional oyster is what they call a diploid oyster that's got two sets of chromosomes, and those oysters are what our natural wild oysters have. And those oysters can grow in good conditions from a tiny seed oyster to a 2.5, 3-inch oyster that's harvestable size in probably 7 months or so. They grow rapidly with our warm water conditions and lots of food availability. Now, a lot of growers are growing what they call triploid oysters now, and there's a special process that is used in order to get an oyster to end up with 3 sets of chromosomes. Triploids, being unique in their chromosome arrangement, are not reproductive spawning animals. They do not have the capability to spawn with that chromosomal arrangement. So triploid oysters don't expend energy spawning, and they grow much faster because of that. They're putting all of their food resources into growing the meat and the muscle inside of the shell. They can get to market a few months faster than diploids.
Erik, what is the latest news about state testing of the waters? Is that scheduled?
Boy, that's a good question. I do not know or have that information in my head. Maybe somebody that's listening out there knows more about that, because I know they have closed all of the waters currently. Precautionary measures, at least for areas like this after a big storm event, they're going to close those harvesting areas for harvesting oysters for consumption. But I don't know what their timetable is to actually come out, test the water, and get results that they need to get back to these growers so they can harvest their product.
Leroy asks, give me 1 second. How did the hatchery survive? Where does protection come from?
Well, I'm not sure if Leroy means the grow areas out here on the leases or actual hatchery facilities, because we do not have any hatchery facilities located in this part of the Panhandle. So we didn't get any impact of that kind of infrastructure here. But we definitely would have if we had hatcheries in Apalachicola, for instance, or East Point, or any of these coastal towns. They would have been impacted just as all of the other structures along our shoreline were with this event.
David Allerston asks, any word on the effects the hurricane had on the oyster reefs in the bay?
That's a good question too, David, and I have not yet talked with oystermen that have been out there to try and assess that. I know there's a big research project that's going on out there, and I know FWC and FDAX and our folks at the university are very interested in finding out how that research study area survived. So I don't have any information yet on that. We're still pretty close to this event.
Was there some stone crab activity impacted?
That's very possible. Stone crabbers, I believe, would have already had their traps out. The season has just opened recently, but they put their gear out prior to the season opening, I believe, typically. I have not seen any summary or assessment of impacts on stone crabbers. But one thing that does happen, if traps are stored in coastal areas and they get inundated by a surge, that equipment gets moved around a lot. I don't think that happened necessarily in this case in our area right now, though.
Now, where does the seed come from?
Oyster seed or clam seed is actually raised at a facility that has the ability to collect brood oysters, brood clams, that brood stock, and spawn those animals to collect the gametes, put them in a tank where they can get fertilized eggs and develop tiny little larvae. Those larvae are then fed and raised up to the stage that they set their shell and start to grow a shell. And at that point, they're put into what we would call a nursery and fed and raised up, usually in nursery areas. People who run those are putting these animals down into the natural waters. If they're on a coast and they have a dock with that set up, they'll have animals in the natural waters, so they're feeding on that plankton and algae in the water, and they're not having to provide food for them at that time. And when they get to a certain size, they will sieve out the ones that are large enough, and they'll sell those.
Laura wants to know, how long does it usually take an oyster to grow in one of those bags?
Well, to get from the seed size that the harvesters buy up to a harvestable product, it varies a little bit depending on conditions in the water and water temperature. But I'm kind of guessing here because I don't have a lot of data on that. Probably 7 months, close to that, or a little sooner for triploid oysters. If we have some other folks out there that have worked with hatchery settings and in this industry, they can chime in with some more details on some of that.
Were the natural Apalachicola oyster beds covered with sand?
I do not know. I have not heard that reported yet, but I don't know how many people have been able to actually get out and do any kind of assessment on those bars yet.
Are shellfish growers eligible for any federal or state assistance to get back to business?
They are. This kind of falls under the agricultural commodities group, and there are programs. There was a program that was set up, it's called DAP for Uninsured, I can't remember the exact title, but Uninsured Disaster Assistance that shellfish farmers were eligible for, but they had to have actually registered and applied for that prior to this event, and many of them did not. So if they weren't registered, that would not provide them any assistance. Other than that, I mean, some of these guys actually have insurance for their product, and there may be some folks out there who know of some other assistance mechanisms. But if they had infrastructure that was damaged, they could possibly be eligible for FEMA assistance and probably several other opportunities.
That was the next question from David. Can these leaseholders get FEMA help for their losses?
Yeah, I'll have to look at some of the rules on that. I'm not exactly very familiar with FEMA policies, but there's a possibility there for sure. And there are some websites that are specific to shellfish growers that talk about providing some of the assistance opportunities. I have seen a fact sheet that was produced by USDA that had some information on it. And if people want to email us, I can send resources like that. My email is elovestrand@ufl.edu, and I'll be happy to send materials to people who send me questions. We do have some highway noise out here because we're only about 50 yards off of Highway 98. But the slope of the land here going up to the highway, that was actually a good thing for these folks to be able to come out and capture, refine, reclaim some of their gear that got broken loose.
Dorothy would like to know, do shellfish prices fluctuate much due to natural disasters like oil prices do?
Yes, I'm sure they do. That's supply and demand thing, and if shellfish are in short supply, the price goes up and growers can get more for their product, but if they don't have the product, it's kind of a wash there. But I have seen some of these aquaculture oysters selling for 50, 60, 70 cents a piece from the grower to a retailer or a dealer. That will mark the price up more before it gets to a restaurant.
David has a question not really pertaining to
Sure.
aquaculture, but he would like to know any effect on the honey production.
Oh, we're going into the river system now because Tupelo honey is a primary commodity for the Apalachicola River Basin. And Tupelo honey production for this season is over with. Beehives are moved into the river floodplain in late March and early April to harvest the Tupelo honey from the nectar in those trees. I don't know if this system has impacted those trees enough with wind damage or anything that it might be a stressor so that the next season's bloom could be affected. But we're just going to have to wait and see, I think, on that. Every year is hit or miss with Tupelo honey production and the amount that they can make.
Erik, could you remind all of us about shellfish.ifas.ufl.edu, which has a lot of great resources?
Oh, absolutely. So sorry. I know who posted that. Thank you very much, Leslie. That is a website that has tremendous resources. Leslie Sturmer is our Sea Grant agent and shellfish specialist down in Cedar Key, and Leslie has tremendous knowledge and background and resources that can provide information that people are looking for. shellfish.ifas.ufl.edu. Very good website. I go there myself to try to learn more. Yeah, maybe Dorothy posted that. I don't know.
Becca.
Okay. Thank you, Becca. Appreciate that. That's a truckload of logs and trees and debris going by. They're trying to get started on cleaning up this mess.
If there's any more questions?
Are there any more questions before we finish up? I appreciate you folks tuning in. All right, we're going to take it off the air, and the end of my first Facebook Live session ever.